In the sterile corridors of military hospitals, where healing and hope walk hand in hand with pain and uncertainty, appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes the quietest person in scrubs carries the loudest thunder in their soul. Sometimes the gentlest hands that tend to wounds have also been trained to end lives with precision. And sometimes, when evil walks through the door with guns blazing, the most unlikely hero emerges from the shadows of ordinary duty. What you're about to discover is how 10 armed terrorists learned the hardest lesson of their lives. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover happens to be wearing hospital scrubs and carries 20 years of elite military training beneath a calm, caring exterior. This is the true story of how one rookie nurse's secret past became a hospital salvation, and how the most dangerous man in the building was hiding in plain sight, saving lives instead of taking them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center as Marcus Thompson walked through the automatic doors for what would become the most important day of his nursing career. At 42 years old, he cut an unremarkable figure in his fresh navy blue scrubs, his graying hair neatly trimmed, and his weathered hands carrying a simple coffee cup. To anyone watching, he appeared to be just another new hire navigating his first weeks in the cardiac intensive care unit. Marcus had spent the past month learning the rhythms of hospital life, memorizing medication schedules, and getting familiar with the electronic charting system that seemed determined to make his life more complicated than any mission briefing he'd ever received. His colleagues saw him as quiet but competent, someone who listened more than he spoke, and who had an unusual calmness during medical emergencies that impressed the veteran nurses. What none of them knew was that Marcus Thompson had spent the previous 20 years as a Navy SEAL, conducting operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. His decision to transition from military service to nursing had been deeply personal, driven by a desire to save lives instead of taking them, to heal instead of harm. After 2 decades of classified missions, midnight raids, and split-second life-or-death decisions, he had grown weary of the violence and yearned for something that would feed his soul instead of haunting his dreams. The transition hadn't been easy. Nursing school at his age, surrounded by students young enough to be his children, had tested his patience and humility in ways that combat never had. But Marcus had approached it with the same methodical determination that had made him one of the Navy's most reliable operators. He studied with the intensity of someone planning a mission, practiced procedures until they became muscle memory, and approached patient care with the same attention to detail that had once kept his team alive in hostile territory. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician in the cardiac unit, had noticed something different about Marcus from his first day. While other new nurses seemed overwhelmed by the controlled chaos of the ICU, Marcus moved through it like he was navigating familiar terrain. His vital signs assessments were thorough and efficient, his medication administration was flawlessly executed, and he had an intuitive sense for reading patients that usually took years to develop. There's something about that new nurse, she had mentioned to her colleague, Dr. Martinez, during their morning coffee break 2 weeks earlier. He's almost too calm, you know? Like he's seen worse things than anything we could throw at him in here. Dr. Martinez had laughed it off. Maybe he worked in emergency rooms before this. Some people are just naturally good under pressure. But Dr. Chen's instincts were sharper than most. She had grown up in a military family and recognized something in Marcus's bearing that spoke of discipline earned in places far more dangerous than any hospital. The way he scanned rooms when he entered them, how he positioned himself with clear sight lines to exits, the manner in which he moved with economic precision. These were habits formed by necessity, not medical training. Marcus's patients adored him. Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher recovering from a triple bypass, had told her daughter that Marcus was different from the other nurses. He listens with his whole attention, she had explained. When he's taking care of me, I feel like I'm the only person in the world who matters to him. That attention to detail and focus had been drilled into Marcus during his SEAL training. In combat, failing to notice a detail could mean death for him and his teammates. In nursing, that same hypervigilance translated into catching subtle changes in patient conditions before they became critical, noticing when someone was experiencing pain they were trying to hide, and providing the kind of presence that made patients feel truly cared for. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was finally using his military training in exactly the way he'd always hoped to protect people. Every medication he administered correctly, every complication he caught early, every moment of comfort he provided to a frightened patient felt like a small redemption for all the violence he'd participated in during his military career. His colleagues in the cardiac unit had begun to rely on his steady presence during their most challenging cases. When Mr. Harrison had gone into cardiac arrest during the night shift 3 weeks ago, it was Marcus who had performed CPR with textbook precision while calmly coordinating with the crash team. When young Corporal Davis had suffered a panic attack after learning he would need a second surgery, it was Marcus who had sat with him for 2 hours, sharing carefully chosen stories about overcoming fear and finding strength in vulnerability. He's like having a calm older brother on a unit, Nurse Jennifer Walsh had told her husband over dinner one evening. Some of these new nurses are so nervous they make me nervous, but Marcus has this way of making everything feel manageable, even when it's not. The morning of October 15th started like any other day in the cardiac unit. Marcus arrived at 6:30 for the 7 o'clock shift change, reviewing patient charts and preparing for the handoff report for the night shift. The unit was caring for 12 patients, including 2 fresh post-operative cases from the previous day's surgeries and several long-term recovery patients who had become like family to the nursing staff. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, a career officer recovering from a severe heart attack, greeted Marcus with his usual joke about the coffee being strong enough to restart his heart without medications. Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter was getting married next month, showed Marcus the latest photos on her phone and made him promise to be extra careful with her medications because she intended to dance at that wedding. As Marcus made his rounds that morning, checking vital signs and administering morning medications, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a routine well executed. Each patient received his full attention, each medication was double-checked, each concern was addressed with patience and expertise. This was what he had trained for, what he had dreamed of during those long nights on foreign soil when the weight of his chosen profession had felt almost unbearable. At 10:15 that morning, Marcus was in room 314 helping Mr. Peterson, a retired firefighter, with his physical therapy exercises when he heard something that made every combat instinct he possessed snap to attention. It was subtle, raised voices from the main corridor that carried a tone he recognized from countless dangerous situations. Not the controlled urgency of medical emergencies, but something sharper, more threatening. His hands continued guiding Mr. Peterson through his arm raises, but his attention was now split between his patient and the sounds filtering through the door. Years of training had taught him to process multiple threat indicators simultaneously while maintaining operational composure. To Mr. Peterson, Marcus appeared completely focused on the exercises, encouraging him and making small talk about his grandchildren's upcoming visit. But beneath that calm exterior, Marcus's mind was rapidly shifting into a different mode of operation. The voices in the hallway were growing louder, and he could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, all male, all carrying the kind of aggressive authority that suggested weapons and bad intentions. His peripheral vision cataloged the room's layout. 1 window facing the courtyard, 1 door with a clear view down the main corridor, and several pieces of medical equipment that could serve as improvised weapons if necessary. The sound from the corridor were becoming clearer now. Shouting in accented English, the distinctive sound of metal on metal that suggested weapons being handled, and, most telling of all, the sudden silence of the usual hospital chatter that meant people were either hiding or had been silenced. Marcus helped Mr. Peterson complete his final arm raise and casually walked toward the door, his movements appearing unhurried and professional. "I'm just going to check on something in the hallway," he told his patient with a reassuring smile. "Keep working on those exercises, and I'll be right back." As he approached the doorway, Marcus could see shadows moving in the main corridor and the unmistakable silhouette of someone carrying what appeared to be an assault rifle. His 20 years of tactical experience identified the weapon profile immediately. K-47, modified with modern accessories, held by someone who knew how to use it. In that moment, Marcus Thompson, the nurse, began a transformation that none of his colleagues could have imagined. The quiet, caring healthcare professional who had been learning their medication schedules and memorizing their computer passwords was simultaneously someone who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of neutralizing exactly this type of threat. But as he stood at that doorway, watching armed figures move through his workplace, Marcus faced a choice that would define not just the next few hours, but potentially the rest of his life. He could reveal his true background and risk everything he had worked for in his new career, or he could trust that security would handle the situation while he focused on protecting his patients through conventional means. The choice became clear when he heard Mrs. Rodriguez scream from down the hall and saw one of the armed figures roughly grab Dr. Chen by the arm. These weren't random criminals looking for drugs or money. Their movements were too coordinated, their positions too tactical, and their apparent goal seemed to be taking control of the entire cardiac unit. Marcus stepped back into Mr. Peterson's room and quietly closed the door, his mind already calculating distances, cover positions, and the locations of every patient and staff member he needed to protect. For the first time in 3 months, he wasn't thinking like a nurse. He was thinking like a Navy SEAL, and 10 heavily armed men were about to discover that their biggest mistake wasn't invading a military hospital. Their biggest mistake was doing it on Marcus Thompson's shift. Marcus Thompson pressed his back against the door of room 314 and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, a technique he'd learned during SEAL training to quickly center himself before engaging the enemy. When he opened them, the transformation was complete. The gentle nurse who had been helping Mr. Peterson with arm exercises was gone, replaced by a predator who had survived dozens of similar situations in some of the world's most dangerous places. "Mr. Peterson," Marcus said quietly, turning to face the retired firefighter whose expression had shifted from confusion to growing alarm. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. There are armed men in this hospital, and they appear to be taking hostages. You're going to slide off this bed very carefully and position yourself in that corner behind the equipment cart. Stay low, stay quiet, and no matter what you hear, don't move until I come back for you." The authority in Marcus's voice was unlike anything Mr. Peterson had heard from him before. Gone was the soft-spoken healthcare provider who had patiently guided him through physical therapy. This was the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders in life-or-death situations, and Mr. Peterson found himself moving without question. "Are you security?" Mr. Peterson whispered as he positioned himself behind the cart. Marcus was already moving toward the small supply cabinet, his trained eyes cataloging potential weapons and tools. "Something like that," he replied, pulling out a pair of surgical scissors and testing their weight. Not ideal, but they would have to do until he could acquire something better. Through the thin door, Marcus could hear the situation in the corridor escalating. Multiple voices were shouting commands in what sounded like Arabic mixed with heavily accented English. Dr. Chen's voice rose above the others, demanding to know what they wanted, her tone carrying the kind of authoritative anger that meant she was trying to protect her patients and staff. Marcus cracked the door open just enough to get a visual assessment of the situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears and activated tactical protocols he hadn't used in 3 years. This wasn't a simple robbery or a mentally unstable individual with a weapon. This was a coordinated assault by what appeared to be at least 10 heavily armed individuals who had positioned themselves with military precision throughout the cardiac unit. 3 men were visible in the main corridor, each carrying assault rifles and wearing dark tactical clothing. Their positions created overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault extremely dangerous. 2 more figures were positioned at the nurse's station, apparently going through computer systems and files. The remaining attackers were likely securing other rooms and establishing perimeter control. Dr. Chen was being held near the central nurse's station by a man who appeared to be the team leader, distinguished by more sophisticated equipment and the way the others deferred to his hand signals. Marcus could see at least 6 staff members and visitors being herded into the family conference room, including Jennifer Walsh and 2 other nurses he'd grown to respect over the past month. The tactical situation was complex and dangerous. Any conventional security response would likely result in casualties among patients and staff who couldn't be evacuated. The attackers had chosen their position well. The cardiac unit was geographically isolated on the hospital's 3rd floor, with limited access routes and dozens of vulnerable patients who couldn't be moved quickly. Marcus closed the door silently and began what he mentally classified as mission planning under combat conditions. His first priority was gathering intelligence about the attackers' numbers, weapons, and objectives. His second priority was establishing secure communications with hospital security or law enforcement. His third priority was developing multiple action plans for protecting the maximum number of innocent lives. Moving with the silent efficiency that had made him legendary among his SEAL teammates, Marcus began converting Room 314 into a temporary operations center. He used his knowledge of the hospital's layout, gained during his month of employment, to identify potential movement routes that would keep him concealed from the attackers while allowing him to gather the intelligence he needed. The ventilation system in the cardiac unit was substantial enough to support his weight, and Marcus had noted during his orientation that the dropped ceiling provided access to the entire floor. What had once been routine job knowledge was now tactical intelligence that could save lives. Marcus squeezed Mr. Peterson's shoulder reassuringly. "I'm going to get help," he whispered. "Remember what I told you. Stay hidden, stay quiet, and wait for me to come back." Using the same silent movement techniques that had allowed him to infiltrate terrorist compounds undetected, Marcus removed a ceiling tile and pulled himself into the space above the patient rooms. The layout was exactly as he'd observed during his nursing orientation, with sufficient space to move between rooms and corridor access points. As he moved through the ceiling toward the nurse's station, Marcus could hear the attackers communicating in rapid Arabic. His language training allowed him to understand enough to confirm his worst fears. This wasn't a hostage situation with demands that could be negotiated. These men were here to cause maximum casualties among military personnel and their families, targeting the cardiac unit specifically because it housed recovering service members and veterans. The leader was giving orders to systematically search patient rooms for high-value targets, including active duty officers and decorated veterans. Mrs. Rodriguez, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, and several other patients were specifically mentioned by name, suggesting this was a carefully planned operation with detailed intelligence about the unit's patient roster. Marcus positioned himself above the main corridor and carefully lifted a ceiling tile to observe the situation below. The tactical picture was worse than he'd initially assessed. He could now see 8 armed individuals positioned throughout the unit, with what appeared to be explosive devices being placed at strategic locations. This wasn't just an attack. It was a planned massacre designed to maximize casualties and create a symbolic victory against American military personnel. Dr. Chun was being forced to access patient files on the computer system, apparently helping the attackers identify which rooms contained their priority targets. Her hands were shaking, but Marcus could see her subtle acts of resistance, entering incorrect passwords, claiming system errors, anything to buy time and protect her patients. Jennifer Walsh and the other staff members were being held in the conference room under guard by 2 attackers. Through the glass walls, Marcus could see that several staff members were injured, likely from resisting the initial takeover. One of the younger nurses appeared to be in shock, and an elderly volunteer was clearly in medical distress. The most critical intelligence Marcus gathered was the attackers' timeline. Based on their radio communications, they had approximately 15 minutes before beginning systematic execution of their priority targets. Hospital security was apparently being held at bay by additional attackers positioned at the unit's main entrances, and law enforcement response was being delayed by what sounded like diversionary attacks at other locations throughout the city. Marcus had operated in similar situations during his military career, but never with so many innocent civilians in immediate danger. Every tactical decision would need to balance maximum neutralization of the threat against minimum risk to patients and staff who couldn't protect themselves. Moving back through the ceiling to a position above the supply room, Marcus dropped down and began gathering equipment for what would become the most important mission of his life. Medical supplies became improvised weapons and tools. Surgical instruments became silent neutralization devices. His knowledge of the hospital's infrastructure became tactical advantages. Marcus opened his cell phone and discovered that the attackers had deployed signal jammers, but his military training included communication protocols for compromised environments. He quickly composed a text message with critical intelligence about the attackers' positions and capabilities, then moved to a location where he could bypass the jamming using the hospital's hardwired communication system. The message he sent to hospital security and local law enforcement was brief and precise. Cardiac ICU under coordinated assault by 8 to 10 heavily armed individuals. Explosive devices present. Request immediate tactical response team. Timeline critical. Execution phase begins in 12 minutes. Former SEAL on scene, beginning defensive operations. As Marcus prepared to begin his one-man counter-assault, he thought about the patients he'd grown to care for over the past month. Mrs. Rodriguez, who showed him pictures of her grandchildren every morning. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, who joked about the coffee, but whose eyes carried the weight of 3 decades of military service. Mr. Peterson, currently hiding behind an equipment cart and trusting that his nurse would somehow keep him safe. These weren't military objectives or strategic assets. They were people who had trusted him with their care, who had welcomed him into their healing process, who represented everything he had hoped to protect when he decided to become a nurse instead of a soldier. Marcus Thompson had spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL, conducting operations that would never be discussed in public, neutralizing threats that most people would never know existed. He had been trained to operate alone behind enemy lines, to improvise weapons and tactics under impossible conditions, and to complete missions regardless of personal cost. But as he prepared to emerge from the shadows and reveal his true capabilities to his colleagues and patients, Marcus realized that this mission was different from anything he'd ever faced. This time, he wasn't fighting for national security or strategic objectives. He was fighting for Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren, for Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's right to recover in peace, for Dr. Chen's dedication to healing, and for his own transformation from someone who took lives to someone who saved them. The 10 armed men who had invaded Walter Reed National Military Medical Center that morning had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They knew about the security systems, the patient roster, and the hospital's layout. They had planned for law enforcement response and civilian casualties. What they hadn't planned for was Marcus Thompson, and they were about to discover that the most dangerous person in the building had been hiding in plain sight, wearing scrubs instead of combat gear, carrying a stethoscope instead of a rifle, but still possessing every skill that had made him one of the Navy's most elite operators. The attack on the cardiac unit was about to become a lesson in why you should never corner a protector in a place full of people he's sworn to keep safe. Marcus Thompson moved through the ceiling above the cardiac unit like a ghost, his 20 years of specialized training allowing him to to navigate the confined space without making a sound. Below him, he could hear the attackers beginning their systematic search of patient rooms, and his window for action was closing rapidly. The first attacker never saw him coming. Marcus dropped silently through a ceiling tile into the supply room adjacent to Mrs. Rodriguez's room, where one of the gunmen was preparing explosive charges. The man's attention was focused on the device he was assembling, giving Marcus the opportunity he needed. Using techniques that had served him in countless similar situations, Marcus approached from behind and applied a sleeper hold with surgical precision. The attacker was unconscious within seconds, his weapon secured before his body hit the floor. Marcus now had his first real weapon, a modified AK-47 with 3 full magazines. But more importantly, he had confirmed his assessment of the attacker's capabilities and equipment. These were well-trained operatives with military-grade weapons and explosives, not random terrorists with improvised devices. Through the wall, he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez whispering prayers in Spanish, her voice trembling with fear as footsteps approached her room. Marcus knew he had seconds to act before the next attacker discovered his colleague's absence. Moving to the door that connected the supply room to Mrs. Rodriguez's room, Marcus timed his entry perfectly with the second attacker's approach. As the gunman entered the patient room, Marcus was already in position behind him. This neutralization was equally swift and silent, but Marcus took an additional moment to reassure his frightened patient. "Mrs. Rodriguez, it's Marcus," he whispered, his voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd grown accustomed to during his morning rounds. "I need you to stay very quiet and hide behind your bed. Help is coming, but I need to go take care of some things first." The elderly woman's eyes widened as she took in the sight of her gentle nurse, holding an assault rifle with the confidence of someone who clearly knew how to use it. But her fear began to transform into something approaching relief as she realized that Marcus, somehow, impossibly, was fighting to protect her. "Are you a soldier, Mijo?" she whispered. Marcus checked the corridor before answering. "I used to be. Right now, I'm your nurse, and that means keeping you safe." The next phase of Marcus's operation required more complex maneuvering. He needed to neutralize the remaining attackers while ensuring that none of them had the opportunity to harm patients or staff, and he needed to disable the explosive devices before they could be detonated remotely. Using his knowledge of the cardiac unit's layout, Marcus began a systematic counterassault that utilized every advantage his environment provided. The hospital setting offered unique tactical opportunities, medical equipment that could provide cover, oxygen lines that could be weaponized, and, most importantly, architectural features that the attackers hadn't accounted for in their planning. Dr. Chun was still being held at the nurse's station, forced to access patient files while the attack leader monitored her actions. Marcus positioned himself with a clear shot, but the presence of medical equipment and the risk of ricochets made a direct engagement too dangerous. Instead, he opted for a more subtle approach. The hospital's fire suppression system could be activated manually from several locations throughout the unit. Marcus triggered the system from a concealed position, immediately filling the main corridor with dense water spray that reduced visibility and created confusion among the remaining attackers. In the chaos that followed, Marcus moved like the predator he had been trained to be. Years of operating in low-visibility environments gave him a decisive advantage over attackers who were suddenly blinded and disoriented. Within 90 seconds, 3 more gunmen had been neutralized, their weapons secured, and their explosive devices disabled. Dr. Chun found herself suddenly free as her captor was efficiently subdued by what appeared to be a phantom moving through the artificial fog created by the sprinkler system. When the spray began to clear and she saw Marcus Thompson standing over the unconscious attacker, her expression shifted from terror to complete bewilderment. "Marcus? What? How did you?" she stammered, staring at the nurse who was now holding multiple assault rifles and wearing the focused expression of someone comfortable with lethal force. "I'll explain later," Marcus replied, already moving toward the conference room where the remaining staff members were being held. "Right now, I need you to start evacuating the patients who can be moved. Get them to the stairwell and down to the second floor. Security should be establishing a safe zone there." The final phase of the engagement required the most delicate operation. 4 attackers remained, including the team leader who had positioned himself in the conference room with the hostages. Any direct assault risked casualties among the staff members Marcus had worked alongside for the past month. Marcus approached the problem the same way he had approached countless hostage situations during his military career, with patience, precision, and an understanding that the lives of innocent people depended on his ability to execute flawlessly under pressure. Using the hospital's communication system, he contacted the remaining attackers directly. "This is the cardiac unit. Your operation has failed. Release the hostages and surrender your weapons, and you'll be taken into custody without further violence." The response was immediate and predictable: demands for safe passage, threats against the hostages, and questions about who they were dealing with. Marcus had heard similar responses in a dozen different languages across 3 continents. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he replied calmly. "I'm a registered nurse in this unit, and I'm also a retired Navy SEAL with 20 years of operational experience. You currently have 4 men left, no escape routes, and law enforcement is establishing perimeter control. Your explosive devices have been disabled, and your mission objectives are no longer achievable." The silence that followed told Marcus everything he needed to know about the attacker's state of mind. They were professionals enough to recognize when their tactical situation had become untenable, but desperate enough to make decisions that could result in unnecessary casualties. The negotiation that followed lasted exactly 7 minutes and ended when the team leader made the mistake of using Jennifer Walsh as a human shield while attempting to reach the stairwell. Marcus had positioned himself with multiple firing angles, and when the opportunity presented itself, he took the shot that ended the threat without harming the hostage. The remaining 3 attackers surrendered when they realized their leader was down and their position was completely compromised. Marcus secured their weapons and maintained control of the situation until hospital security and law enforcement tactical teams arrived to take custody. As the immediate danger passed and emergency responders began flooding the cardiac unit, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in the middle of the chaos he had helped end, still holding an assault rifle, surrounded by colleagues who were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to awe to complete confusion. Dr. Chun was the first to approach him, her medical training overriding her amazement as she noticed blood on his sleeve from a graze he'd sustained during the final engagement. "We need to get that looked at," she said, her voice carrying the professional authority that Marcus had come to respect during their time working together. "It's just a scratch," Marcus replied, setting down the weapon and beginning to transition back to his role as a healthcare provider. Around him, patients who had been hiding in their rooms were being evacuated by emergency personnel, and he could see Mrs. Rodriguez being helped into a wheelchair, her eyes searching the crowd until they found him. She called out to him in Spanish, her voice carrying gratitude and affection that made Marcus realize how much his new life meant to him, how much these people had come to matter to him in ways that his military missions never had. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was wheeled past on a stretcher, insisting to the EMTs that he was fine and demanding to know what had happened to that nurse who was helping me with my exercises. When he saw Marcus, his expression shifted to something approaching recognition. "I knew there was something different about you," the career officer said as his stretcher was momentarily paused. "That kind of calm under fire doesn't come from medical school." Over the following hours, as statements were given and reports were filed, the full scope of what had occurred in the cardiac unit became clear. 10 heavily armed attackers had attempted to carry out a coordinated assault designed to maximize casualties among military personnel and their families. Their plan had been sophisticated, their intelligence accurate, and their execution professional. What they hadn't anticipated was Marcus Thompson, whose quiet dedication to his patients and colleagues had mass capabilities that turned their carefully planned assault into a complete tactical failure. The media coverage that followed focused on the heroic actions of a nurse who had saved dozens of lives. But Marcus declined most interview requests and asked that his military background be mentioned only in general terms. He wasn't interested in being celebrated as a warrior. He wanted to be recognized as a protector, someone who had used his skills to preserve life rather than take it. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson was still working in the cardiac unit at Walter Reed, still making his quiet rounds, and still providing the kind of patient care that had made him beloved by his colleagues and patients alike. The only visible change was a small commendation pin on his ID badge, and the fact that new employees were occasionally told the story of the day their unit was attacked by terrorists and saved by a nurse. Mrs. Rodriguez, now fully recovered and back home with her family, sent Marcus a Christmas card every year with photos of her grandchildren. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson made a point of visiting whenever he was in the area, bringing coffee that was strong enough to restart a heart, and sharing stories about his own military service with someone who truly understood. Dr. Chun had recommended Marcus for every nursing award the hospital offered, and had also quietly suggested to the administration that his unique background might be valuable in developing emergency response protocols for similar situations. But for Marcus Thompson, the greatest reward was simpler and more profound. Every morning when he walked through the automatic doors of the cardiac unit, he was greeted by colleagues who trusted him completely, patients who depended on his care, and the knowledge that he had finally found a way to use his considerable skills in service of healing rather than harm. The 10 gunmen who had invaded the hospital that October morning had taught him the final lesson he needed about his own transformation. When pressed to choose between the warrior he had been and the healer he was becoming, Marcus Thompson had discovered that the two identities weren't contradictory. They were complementary. Sometimes the most effective way to save lives is to be prepared to take them. Sometimes the gentlest hands are also the most dangerous. And sometimes the person best equipped to protect the innocent is someone who has walked in darkness long enough to truly appreciate the light. Marcus Thompson, Navy SEAL turned registered nurse, had found his true calling not in spite of his military background, but because of it. In a world that often demanded warriors, he had chosen to be both a guardian and a healer, and his patients were safer because of it.